The Fed is leaving rates unchanged in July, but the likelihood of a September cut seems to be increasing. At least that's the perception. Fed Chair Jay Powell saying a cut could come as soon as the next meeting. For more, we're bringing in someone who was at Powell's presser. That is Nick Timiraos. He's chief economics correspondent at the Wall Street Journal. Nick, it's good to see you here. So, as always, the Fed chair tried to not say explicitly September is happening. The market is taking it that way. We're seeing swaps traders now pricing in 3 cuts still this year. Do you think that's the right interpretation here?
Ask me after the payroll number comes out tomorrow. Yeah. It's hard to say. Markets have to take a view of what's going to happen down the road. I don't. What I would say is that I thought Powell came as close yesterday as he could to saying September without making some promise that someone could hold up later if for whatever reason they decided not to do it. And I'm not sure why the communication came out that way. But nevertheless, I mean, if you look at the policy statement that came out at 2 p.m., sometimes when the Fed is ready to cut rates but isn't doing it at that meeting, they'll put something in the guidance. Yesterday, they could have weakened the guidance around, we won't cut rates until we have greater confidence. They could have said until we have some greater confidence. They chose not to do that. In his opening statement at the press conference, Powell also didn't say anything new in the monetary policy guidance section of his opening remarks. So he left it all for the Q&A. But in the Q&A, he said it could come as soon as September. So again, I think he went as close to the line of saying, the market's not wrong about September without actually saying the code words that would make it seem like more of a promise.
Can I get your kind of insight, Nick, on one data point that got some attention today? I'm curious, investors looking at this economic data, ISM manufacturing, Nick, and the unemployment measure sank to 43. It was the lowest since June 2020. I'm just curious, Nick, when you kind of, the economists you read and talk to, if you heard any kind of feedback on that.
Again, I think the number tomorrow just will matter a lot more. ISM, yes, I realize this employment subindex was very weak today. It's bounced around a bit, both in the manufacturing and the non-man index. But it's one data point that I think is quickly going to be overtaken by a bigger data point tomorrow.
And as for that data point tomorrow, there has been a lot of commentary that the Fed should have cut yesterday. What was your assessment of the committee sort of acknowledging the risks of unemployment slowing further and how they're weighing that?
Well, I think the issue right now on the committee is really one where I think the hawks, people who have been reluctant to entertain cutting, there's a question to ask right now, which is where are upside inflation risks going to come from in an economy where the VU, the vacancy to unemployed worker ratio, is fallen to where it was before the pandemic. You have hiring rates down, layoff rates are low, so turnover is low. To the extent you're worried that people are going to bid up wages by changing jobs, that doesn't seem to be happening. You had a fairly cool employment cost index report on Wednesday. So the labor market, as Powell said yesterday, doesn't seem to be a source of inflation risk. So if you're worried about inflation, where is it going to come from? Is it going to come from abroad? Probably not with what you're seeing from the dollar and commodities right now. I think that's the issue right now. The Fed says that the risks are more balanced between their inflation and employment mandate. But I do think the market is looking at it saying, well, we see downside risks much more on the employment side than we see upside risks on the inflation side. And, they're putting their money to play accordingly. Now, back in May, the market only saw one cut this year, and people were talking about, well, is the Fed going to have to go back to having a neutral bias or a hiking bias in the statement? And Powell sort of dismissed that and seems to have been, had that view vindicated. But this is obviously a different situation.
And Nick, you also wrote about policy changes during election years. I'm just curious what you made of Powell's commentary about that topic.
Well, his commentary hasn't changed at all in the 6 years now that he's been Fed chair. I mean, he says the same thing every time the question comes up. No, we don't take politics into account. If you look at what the Fed has been trying to accomplish here, getting inflation down without having unnecessary weakness to the labor market, I mean, that's a really big lift. There's so much more at stake than trying to figure out, well, this election or that election. But nevertheless, the question comes up all the time. I hear it from my readers all the time. Well, the Fed must be doing this. I can't understand why they would cut, or I can't understand why they wouldn't cut. Therefore, it must be politics. If you listen to what Fed officials say, if you look at how they've behaved before past elections, there's no evidence that they take politics into account. I do think it makes their communication more difficult. And so I do think if you're going to cut interest rates, if you're going to start a cutting cycle in June of this year or September of this year, as opposed to next year, then you just have to explain it, very clearly for the people in the back of the room. Make sure they can hear it, why you're doing this, that it really isn't about politics. I think there are some people that the Fed just is never going to be able to convince, and they're just going to look at this and say, well, I can't understand it, therefore it must be politics. And those probably aren't the people the Fed is trying to assuage with the answers like what Powell said yesterday.
Right, and Powell definitely tried to be very clear in that answer. Finally, Nick, since we have you here, as we talk about all of this policy, monetary policy, we also want to acknowledge the milestone that's happened for you all at the Wall Street Journal with reporter Evan Gershkovich being freed by Russia. I know this has been a big effort on the part of the Journal staff. And so just wanted to acknowledge that and get your reaction. And I'm sure that you and the other folks in the newsroom have been celebrating this today.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, I'm obviously thrilled. It's profoundly good news. And everybody here is really excited and, very appreciative of what others, particularly in the press, have done to keep attention on this. And of course, everybody in the government who worked so hard to secure his release. I'm happy for him and for him to be reunited with his family.
Definitely. Nick, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.